I ain't African. We were already here every day. Juneteenth just makes it louder, especially today. It's Juneteenth is for Black Americans. People confuse identity with examination because the moment somebody asks, why does being not African matter so much to you? The conversation changes. Suddenly, it's family records, photographs, oral histories, lineage, stories, proof, everything except the question. And that's interesting because the question ain't, can your family trace back here? The question ain't, does somebody in your family already live on this land? The question ain't, do you have indigenous ancestry? The question is, why does being not African matter so much to you? That ain't a history question. That's an examination question. Examination makes people uncomfortable because examination asks, what am I getting from this? Why do I need this distinction? Why does this separation matter so much? Why does being the exception matter so much? That's where the conversation really is, not Africa, the reward. Because people rarely defend something that gives them nothing. So what is the reward? Belonging, validation, significance. That's the attachment. Attachment to distinction, attachment to separation, attachment to identity through contrast. And that leads to another question. Why Africa? Seriously, why Africa? Because people don't spend as much energy distancing themselves from things they admire. Nobody spends all day saying, I ain't French, I ain't Italian, I ain't Norwegian, so why Africa? What exactly are you trying to separate yourself from? Because the moment that question shows up, the conversation stops being about history and becomes about value. For centuries, people used the construct to determine what mattered, which cultures mattered, which histories mattered, which languages mattered, which appearances mattered, which people mattered. Then people repeated those ideas, rewarded those ideas, built institutions around those ideas, passed those ideas forward. So for some people, distance from Africa becomes status, becomes validation, becomes significance. Distance becomes, I ain't that. And that deserves examination. Then people say, we were already here. Okay. What does that mean specifically? What are you claiming? Because if your family has lived here for generations, then that proves your family's lived here for generations. Nobody argues that. Yet somewhere between my family's been here for generations and I ain't African, a leap happens. That's the interesting part because those ain't the same statement. One statement describes lineage. The other describes identity. One tells me where your family lived. The other tells me what you're trying to separate yourself from. And every time I ask about the leap, people stop examining the leap and start defending the identity. That's where the sloppy language starts. Because a statement about lineage suddenly becomes a statement about identity. That's where the lazy logic starts. Because proving your family's been here for generations doesn't automatically prove you ain't African. Those are different claims. That's where the performance begins. Because instead of examining the leap, people defend it. That's where attachment enters. Because when people attach to an answer, protecting the answer becomes more important than examining it. Ask a few questions. Ask how they arrived there. Ask what they're basing it on. Ask them to walk you through it. Questions will appear. Gaps will appear. Uncertainty will appear. Then the certainty gets louder, not the evidence, the certainty, because certainty feels better than saying, I don't know. So people rush toward conclusions, attach to the conclusions, defend the conclusions, build identities around the conclusions, and eventually they stop protecting an idea, they start protecting themselves. People blame social media. I don't. Human beings build the platforms. Human beings reward the behavior. Human beings create the echo chambers. Social media is the vehicle. Human beings provide the fuel. That is important. If the human being disappears from the analysis, responsibility disappears too. Suddenly race is the problem. Social media is the problem. The algorithm is the problem. Meanwhile, the human being disappears. No, the human being stays right there, creating the attachment, defending the attachment, rewarding the attachment, reproducing the attachment. That's why these conversations keep looping, because they ain't really about Africa. They ain't really about ancestry. They ain't really about Juneteenth. Those are containers. The attachment moves through the container. The reward moves through the container. The need for significance moves through the container. And when I observe that, I stop caring about the race conversation itself, because race ain't the root. Race is the racialized expression. Dominance and supremacy is the construct. Humanity is the source. The source is the human tendency to organize through separation, hierarchy, ranking, exclusion, control, the need to feel significant by placing yourself above, apart from, or against someone else. The construct grows from those tendencies. The containers carry it. The expressions perform it. And because people stay trapped inside the containers, they never reach the source. Race becomes the ceiling of analysis. Everything gets reduced back to race. Everything gets interpreted through race. Everything gets explained through race. And when that happens, people stop seeing the larger construct. That's why this conversation exhausts me, because everyday people keep showing the same pattern. Draw a distinction, attach to the distinction. Receive a reward from the distinction, defend the distinction, then mistake the distinction for reality. What's wild is that the same people who recognize line drawing when somebody else does it suddenly stop recognizing it when they do it themselves. We lived with consequences of categories. We've lived with the consequences of classifications. We've lived with the consequences of legitimacy tests. We've lived with the consequences of people drawing lines and assigning value to those lines. So why imitate it? Why reproduce it? Why carry it forward? Because Juneteenth is supposed to point toward freedom, not another category, not another distinction, not another hierarchy. Freedom. And if freedom is the goal, then the question ain't who was here first. The question is, why are we still attached to the mechanisms that keep reproducing the ineffective construct? Because freedom requires more than changing positions inside the construct. Freedom requires examining the attachment itself. That's the word. Not another argument about Africa. Not another argument about ancestry. Not another argument about who lived here first. The examination. Until people examine the attachment, the container changes. The language changes. The story changes, the identity changes, yet the construct stays exactly where it is. So when somebody says, I ain't African, I don't find myself asking where their grandmother lived. I find myself asking, why does being not African matter so much to you? Because that's where the attachment lives. That's where the examination begins.